And added to this is the fact that Benjamin seemed to be winning the third battle too. 30 Israelites were dead, slain by Benjamite swords. The enemy is in flight. We've got them on the run. This is what happened the previous two battles. This time we'll surely be victorious. This time we may vanquish them. This may be the final time. They may leave us alone after this, and we will win. But their pride only presaged their fall. Scripture graphically portrays the very moment that the Benjamites realized they were done for. When the flame, verse 40 says, but when the flame began to arise up out of the city, that was the moment. When the flame began to rise up out of the city with a pillar of smoke, the Benjamites looked behind them, and behold, the flame of the city ascended up to heaven. And when the men of Israel turned again, the men of Benjamin were amazed, for they saw that evil, that calamity, that disaster was come upon them. That was the turning point. Then they knew they were doomed. Before this, and vainly, they tried to deceive themselves that they were okay, that they would not be disciplined by the church, that they would not be disciplined by God, but that their cause was good, and they would stick it out. We're Benjamites. We have been with Israel, the church, right from the start. We have a pedigree here as good as any of the other tribes. We have been in Israel for a very long time, hundreds of years. And when the calamity finally falls upon them, verse 41 says, they're amazed. This couldn't be happening to us. Surely not. I can't take it in. I'm under discipline now. We're about to be destroyed. And in that moment, what they tried to repel, tried to deny, was unescapable. And when someone falls by their sin under church discipline, this same amazement comes upon them because they think this isn't going to happen. They're not going to discipline me, are they? That's what Benjamin thought. And then they knew. And what is the theological evaluation of the near destruction of Benjamin? What is the theological evaluation given by God in our text? And that's an important question to ask, because Scripture interprets Scripture in general. You interpret all Scripture in the light of other Scripture. But you especially interpret Scripture in the light of the little clues, so to speak, in the text itself. Most of Old Testament narrative consists of, well, this is what happened, and then this, and then that, but occasionally, and through the narrative, or at the end, or at the start, there's a bit where God passes judgment. Well, what does this passage say? Well, several things ought to be noticed here. First of all, the name given throughout our text, and indeed throughout Judges 19 through 21, for those who attack Benjamin. They are not here called the 11 tribes. Now, I have called them the 11 tribes. That wasn't necessarily wrong on my part. Isn't wrong, actually. I have called them that, but the passage calls them Israel. They're not just 11 tribes. It's not just 11 tribes versus one tribe. It's Israel, the people of God, the church in the Old Testament. Not one tribe versus 11 tribes, but Israel, the church, over against erring, sinful Benjamin. The church against Benjamin. No matter how Benjamin might try and get around it, Benjamin here is opposed, the passage keeps stating this, by Israel, the church of God. Not a ragtag group, not more against few, but the church, Israel. And this too is something that an erring child of God needs to consider in church discipline. God forbid that it would happen. But you're not dealing with a few men in the consistory or a few sinners in the church or some other ragtag group. If the discipline is properly being affected, I'll say more about that later, you're dealing with the church. God's church. And if you put yourself outside the church by remaining impenitent, the church will still be church. Israel will still be Israel. But you're not part of it. You're outside Israel, the church. That's serious. And second, and here I'm using New Testament terminology, the 11 tribes, more properly speaking, Israel, have the means of grace. And here we go back to verses 26 through 28. In Israel there is the tabernacle with the Ark of the Covenant, symbolizing God's covenant presence with His people. And along with the tabernacle comes the priesthood which officiates at the tabernacle. The priests offer sacrifices, types and pictures of Jesus Christ and His atonement. And here, in Judges 20 verse 28, a very venerable man is mentioned. Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, the son of Aaron, the high priest, and the grandson of Israel's first high priest. And there are especially 3 stories which stand out in Scripture concerning Phinehas' godliness. The first one, we sung of this in Psalm 106, is taken from Numbers 25, and indeed we had a sermon on that a while back, where Phinehas takes the spear and thrusts it through the middle of the 2 fornicators in Israel, and for which God grants him the covenant of peace. And then in Numbers 31, a passage not as well known, but Phinehas leads the armies of Israel, some 12,000 men, against Midian, and he blows the sacred trumpet. They win that battle too. And in Joshua 22, when the tribes on the west of the Jordan wrongly think that the tribes in the east of the Jordan, the half-tribe of Manasseh, Gad and Reuben, are creating a schism and leaving them because they put up an altar which they called Ed or Witness, Israel sends as its leader Phinehas, the leading figure in the church in those days. And so Benjamin ought to have realized, again to use New Testament terms, that it wasn't just dealing with church, it was dealing with God's church with the 3 marks: the preaching, the sacraments, the means of grace are with Israel. The presence and power of Jesus Christ, the keys of the kingdom of heaven that God has placed in Israel. And we, Benjamin, we don't have the ark. We don't have the tabernacle. We don't have the priesthood. And we don't have sacrifices for sin. And those who fall under church discipline today don't have the New Testament means of grace either. And if ever this were to happen to you, and you were to fall under church discipline, you consider very, very seriously where this is going to lead. Assuming that you have indeed sinned and that the case has been prosecuted properly according to the church order, then you're going against the whole church. God is in the church, and the means of grace, and you're putting yourself outside of a manifestation of the kingdom of heaven without the means of grace on your own. And it's cold and lonely out there.